Hey everyone, ready for some serious geopolitics? Buckle up because we're doing a deep dive today into a recent Daily Mail article that has it's got everyone kind of freaking out a little bit.
Yeah.
This article claims that Ukrainian President Zelensky gave NATO a pretty shocking ultimatum
Yeah.
and, one that could have like huge global consequences.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation for sure.
So the article is alleging that Zelensky basically told NATO, look, either let Ukraine into the alliance or we're going to rearm ourselves with nuclear weapons, which is a very intense statement.
Yeah.
And apparently this all went down at a recent EU summit in Brussels.
Right.
And, it's safe to say that it's causing a lot of concern worldwide.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's important to consider the whole context here. NATO is a defensive military alliance.
Right.
And Article 5 of their treaty is very clear. It says an attack on one member is an attack on all members.
Right.
So if Ukraine were to join NATO right now, in the middle of this conflict with Russia, it could set off a chain reaction and pull all the NATO members into the war.
Yeah, that's a very, very heavy responsibility.
Yeah.
And, no wonder this ultimatum is causing such a big stir. But here's the thing. The article mentions that this isn't even the first time Zelensky has brought this idea up.
Oh, really?
Yeah, apparently he proposed the same thing to former U.S. President Trump.
That definitely adds another layer to this.
The article says that Zelensky argued that if Ukraine was a member of NATO, it would give them the security guarantees they need to protect themselves from Russia. And he even claims that Trump agreed with him at the time.
Well, it's really hard to verify these claims without more, evidence to back them up. But they certainly do highlight the pressure that Zelensky is under as this war keeps dragging on.
Right.
The Institute for the Study of War has actually described Russia's strategy as a war of attrition, which basically means that they're trying to wear down Ukraine and exhaust the support they're getting from the West.
Right. So Zelensky's feeling the heat. And maybe this ultimatum is kind of a desperate attempt to, shake things up and break the stalemate. But could this be pushing him towards even riskier strategies? Because the article also mentions that he wants to bring the war back into Russia, like actually using longer-range missiles to hit targets inside of Russia.
That's certainly a high-stakes approach.
Yeah.
According to the article, Zelensky's reasoning is that if the Russian people start feeling the direct consequences of the war, they might turn against Putin and demand an end to it.
It's a big gamble, though, for sure.
Definitely.
And it's not one that Western allies seem to be very enthusiastic about supporting. They've been really hesitant to provide those longer-range missiles, probably because attacking targets within Russia could be seen as a major escalation.
Yeah, that hesitation makes sense. Those actions could easily be interpreted as a direct attack on Russia itself, which could trigger a much wider conflict. And then you have to think about the unintended consequences. Even if a strike hits its intended target, there's always the risk of collateral damage or miscalculation, which could spiral out of control.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really, really concerning.
Yeah.
Because the article then drops another bombshell. Zelensky claims that North Korea is getting ready to send 10,000 soldiers to join Russia's fight in Ukraine.
Wow.
And this is on top of the 10,000 North Korean soldiers that have already been deployed.
Right, right.
And Zelensky actually said that North Korea's involvement is the first step to world war.
Yeah, well, bringing North Korea into the mix definitely adds a very volatile element. I mean, we already know they've been supplying Russia with ballistic missiles and artillery shells throughout the war, which is obviously a big concern.
A complicated situation.
For sure. In June 2024, Russia and North Korea signed a mutual defense pact, which really solidified their alliance. And if you add that to the UK Ministry of Defense's assessment that North Koreans are likely already fighting and dying in Ukraine, it makes Zelensky's fears about a larger conflict seem a lot more plausible.
And as if things weren't complicated enough, Zelensky is also worried about Iran getting even more involved. They've already been giving Russia kamikaze drones, but now there are concerns that Iran might actually send soldiers as well.
Yeah, the possibility of this regional conflict pulling in more and more countries is very troubling. If nations like North Korea and Iran become directly involved, it could completely change the dynamics of the war.
So we're looking at a situation where Zelensky is giving out ultimatums, pushing for some very risky strategies, and expressing serious concerns about the conflict expanding. It's a lot to digest. What does it all mean? What are the potential consequences of all of this? And where could this be heading?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll analyze the potential risks and rewards of Zelensky's strategies and explore what they could mean for Ukraine, the region, and the world.
Stay tuned. So we just laid out a lot to think about, with Zelensky's actions and all the other players that might get involved in this conflict. But let's take a step back for a second and really think about what could happen if things keep escalating.
Yeah. It's really crucial to consider the potential consequences of Zelensky's ultimatum, especially that threat to rearm Ukraine with nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, if Ukraine actually acquired nuclear weapons, it would completely shatter the global nuclear non-proliferation regime.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't like nuclear policy experts, can you break down what that means exactly?
Sure. So the nuclear non-proliferation regime is basically a set of international treaties and agreements that are designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. It's been a cornerstone of global security since the end of the Cold War. It's helped to limit the number of countries that have nuclear capabilities. So if Ukraine were to break with this regime, it could set a really dangerous precedent for other nations that are facing security threats. And that could potentially trigger a whole new wave of nuclear proliferation.
So it's not just that Ukraine getting nuclear weapons would escalate tensions with Russia, but it could actually have ripple effects across the entire globe.
Exactly. And we can't forget about how Russia itself might react. I mean, they've already shown that they're willing to use military force to get what they want, and they've even made some veiled threats about using nuclear weapons.
Right.
So a nuclear-armed Ukraine would probably be seen as an existential threat by Moscow, which could lead to a much more aggressive and unpredictable response from Russia.
It's a scary thought.
Uh-huh.
And even if we put the whole nuclear issue aside for a minute, Zelensky's idea of hitting targets inside Russia with longer-range missiles also carries a lot of risk. We talked about this a little earlier, but I think it's worth digging a little deeper.
You're right. While Zelensky argues that those kinds of strikes could turn the Russian people against Putin, there's a real chance that it could backfire.
Right.
Russia might feel like they have to retaliate, and not just against Ukraine. They might even target NATO countries that are supporting Ukraine.
So we could be looking at a scenario where the conflict spills over Ukraine's borders, pulls in NATO members, and explodes into a much bigger war.
Exactly. And because the global economy is so interconnected, any major conflict would have huge consequences. We're already seeing how the war in Ukraine is affecting energy prices, food supplies, global trade.
Right.
A wider conflict would just make those disruptions even worse, leading to economic instability and potentially widespread humanitarian crises.
It's a pretty grim picture for sure. But even if things don't totally spiral out of control, even if the fighting stays within Ukraine, are there other ways that Zelensky's strategies could backfire?
Absolutely. His aggressive rhetoric and these high-risk moves could alienate some of Ukraine's most important allies. The very countries that are providing the military and financial support they desperately need.
Right.
While those countries understand what Ukraine is going through, they also have to think about the risks of escalation.
Yeah.
If Zelensky is seen as pushing them too far, they might be less willing to keep giving aid at the same level.
So he's walking a really fine line. He needs to project strength and determination, but also reassure his allies that he's not going to drag them into a bigger war. That's a tough balancing act.
It is. And we can't forget about the impact on the Ukrainian people themselves. This war has already caused so much suffering, millions of people displaced cities, destroyed a staggering number of deaths.
Right.
If the conflict keeps going for years, if it escalates even further, the human costs will just keep rising.
It's a pretty bleak picture. But is there any hope here? Is there any chance that Zelensky's gamble could pay off, that his actions could actually lead to something positive? We spent a lot of time talking about the risks and what could go wrong with Zelensky's actions. But even when things look really bad, it's important to try and find some hope. Is there any way, any scenario where this could end peacefully?
Well, even though the situation seems incredibly difficult right now, history has shown us that even the worst conflicts can eventually reach a negotiated settlement. The key is figuring out what would make that possible.
So where do we even start? What are the things that would need to happen for a peace agreement to work?
The most important thing is that both sides have to be willing to negotiate and to actually mean it. Right now, with all the fighting and the deep mistrust between Ukraine and Russia, that seems like a long shot.
Yeah, Zelensky's talking about taking the fight to Russia, and Putin seems determined to crush Ukraine. It's hard to imagine them sitting down and talking anytime soon.
I get it. But as this war drags, on both sides are going to feel the pain more and more. Not just the loss of life, but the economic damage and the political pressure. Eventually, finding a way out, even if it means compromise, might start to look a lot better than fighting forever.
So you're saying that just being exhausted and feeling the weight of all the consequences could actually push them towards a deal?
It's definitely possible, and that's where the rest of the world can help. International pressure from powerful countries, especially those that have influence with both Russia and Ukraine, could really help to create a better environment for negotiations.
So we need countries to act as mediators. Try to bridge the gap between the two sides and get them talking.
Exactly. There have been some attempts to do that already, but so far they haven't been very successful. But as the risks of this conflict getting even worse become more obvious, the international community might feel more urgency to step up those diplomatic efforts.
Okay, so let's just say for a minute that those efforts work. Both sides agree to a ceasefire, and they actually come to the table. What would a realistic peace agreement even look like? What kind of compromises would they have to make?
That's a tough question. Any agreement that's going to last would have to deal with the root causes of the conflict. For Ukraine, the main thing is security. They need to know that Russia won't just invade again in a few years, which is why they've been so insistent about joining NATO.
But we talked about how that's a non-starter for Russia. They see NATO expansion as a direct threat to their security. So how do you solve that?
It would take creative solutions and compromises from both sides. Maybe Ukraine would have to agree to some form of neutrality. They wouldn't join any military alliance, but they would get security guarantees from a bunch of countries, including powerful ones like the US, China, maybe even Russia itself.
That sounds really tricky. And what about the territory that Russia is occupying? It's hard to imagine Ukraine just accepting that as part of a deal.
You're right. The issue of their territory is really sensitive for Ukraine. Any agreement would probably involve some tough concessions from both sides. Maybe Russia would agree to withdraw their troops gradually, and there would be international monitors and peacekeepers to keep things stable in those areas.
Those are some big ifs.
Yeah.
And even if they could agree on all of that, who's to say it would actually stick? There's a lot of mistrust to overcome.
Definitely. Building trust is essential, and that doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, constant communication, and both sides showing that they're serious about peace.
It's not going to be easy, and there are no guarantees.
Nope.
So we're left with a lot of uncertainty, a lot of different ways this could go, each with its own risks and rewards. But what's the main thing you hope listeners will take away from all of this?
The situation is incredibly complex, and the stakes couldn't be higher. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes, but it's so important for us to stay informed, to really think about this conflict, and to consider what might happen depending on the choices that are made.
Because this isn't just some abstract geopolitical thing happening on a map. This is a human tragedy with real people's lives at stake.
Exactly. And the decisions that leaders make in the next weeks and months will have a huge impact on millions of lives, not just in Ukraine and Russia, but potentially all over the world.
It's a lot to think about.
Well,
Well, thank you for taking the time to break all of this down with us and help us understand this incredibly complex and important situation. And to everyone listening out there, stay informed, stay engaged, and let's hope for a peaceful resolution to this conflict.